First of all, welcome. My name is David Ballou, and I'm Vice President of External Affairs at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. We call it MCHC. We are home of the largest collection of Maryland history, inclusive of 350,000 objects and artworks in the museum, and 7 million books, documents, and manuscripts in the library. And that collection forms so many exciting things that happen here, from our publications to research that happens in the library to many of the exhibitions that you can visit today. And if you're interested in Maryland history, which I think you are because you're here with us today, then I would encourage you to consider becoming a member of MCHC. So today we're going to be learning from Dr. Seth Bruggeman, who is a professor of history at Temple University, where he also directs the Center for Public History. A graduate of the College of William and Mary's PhD program in American Studies, Bruggeman studies the role of memory in public life, and particularly how Americans have used objects in museums, monuments, historic preservation, and other commemorative spaces to exert control over how we understand the past. His courses concern American cultural history, material culture, memory preservation, and public history, and books include Lost on the Freedom Trail, Born in the USA, Birth and Commemoration in American Public Memory, and Here, George Washington Was Born, Memory, Material Culture, and the Public History of a National Monument. Today, Dr. Bruggeman is building on this impressive body of work with the lecture In Our Time, But Not of It, Race, Memory, and Profit on Maryland's Eastern Shore. And just thank you so much for coming with us today. So with that, I'm happy to introduce Dr. Bruggeman. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction. And let me just take a moment, too, to thank everybody that works at the center. You folks have been so great this past year in supporting me. I see Micah back there, who dealt with all my ridiculous requests, and we'll have more very soon. So thank you for that. And I just had a chance to meet Catherine for the first time. Thank you so much for supporting me. I was looking quickly at the story about your dad, and we both went to Penn State, too. So there are lots of interesting connections. So my purpose today is to talk about my research over the last year, which has broadly concerned the history of public memory on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, roughly from the end of the American Civil War until the first decades of the 20th century. And so my purpose within that big story is to think a little bit about how folks during those years on the Eastern Shore thought about, or actually remembered, maritime labor. And when I say maritime labor, what really interests me is the kind of work that people do on boats, in the fisheries, pretty much everywhere in coastal communities up and down the Eastern Shore. So I want to share some insights about this research today, not conclusions, because this is still very much in progress, and it's all very raw and a little half-baked. So please bear with me as I work through my thoughts on this project. In fact, you're the first people I'm speaking with it about. So maybe by the time we get to the Q&A, you can help me think about how to move forward with this project. So to do this, let me start by telling you a little bit about the kinds of questions I ask in my work and the questions that I brought to this project. I told you just a second ago that I write about the history of memory, which may strike some of you as odd. Often people say, well, aren't history and memory the same thing? But I'm here to tell you there's an entire body of scholarship. Huh? Sure our technology is working here. I'll use the old-fashioned way. There's an entire body of scholarship that I participate in that's organized around asking some critical questions about memory. So I want to just share with you what these key questions are, and it'll help you understand how I'm going to talk with you about the work I've been doing here at the center over the last year. 3 critical memory questions. The first one has to do with choices. What is it? How do people go about choosing what to remember and what not to remember over time? This is sort of the structure of memory studies, one of the core questions that drives the work of people who do what I do. this is a question that you all probably see most frequently played out in the heritage landscape in terms of historic preservation. What houses should we preserve? What houses should we not preserve, right? It's a very common debate, one that I wrote about in my first book as the debate played out at the site of George Washington's birth, where there's a decades-long argument about which house to preserve to remember his birth. And you may ask, are there many houses? And in fact, there were. George Washington's birth house was destroyed during the Revolution, but a Patriotic Women's Association built a replica of it. But only months later, the National Park Service discovered that the actual foundations of the house were about 50 feet away from the replica. And thus arose this debate about which one was more authentic, the replica or the foundations. And that debate roiled the National Park Service for a generation. Fundamental question, what do we choose to remember? What do we not choose to remember? So I got a whole book out of that one, and others have done that kind of work too. Second question that motivates me and people who study the history of memory has to do with how we go about convincing others to remember the way that we remember. So once we decide what to choose to remember, how do we then convince others that that's the right choice, right? How do we get everybody to remember in the same way? This is a process of creating what historians refer to as collective memory, or what today I'll refer to as public memory. And it's another question that has run through my scholarship. So my most recent book is about Boston and Boston's historic Freedom Trail. Any of you who have ever visited Boston have probably seen this red line that's painted on the sidewalks, and it leads tourists from one historic site to another that all figured in the American Revolution. And what the book does is frames the story of the Freedom Trail as a story about creating a tool that aims to create collective memory. The Freedom Trail was only drawn on those sidewalks during the 1950s, at a time when Boston was being structurally reorganized by urban renewal, large parts of the city being demolished, being rebuilt. The idea behind the Freedom Trail was to ensure a particular kind of collective memory be mapped onto the city, even though its landscape was changing. And so that process of trying to ensure that everybody remembers the same way, it's a very complicated one that gets very political, and one that has interested historians of memory for a long time. Finally, third question that really interests me. It's a question that grows from an observation. There are two critical moments of memory in every act of remembering. There is the moment that you are remembering, often in the distant past, right? So the folks at George Washington's birthplace are remembering a moment in 1732 when he was born. But then there's a moment wherein you are doing the memory. You are remembering. At Washington's birthplace, that was happening in the 1930s. 1930s, remembering back to the 1730s. In Boston with the Freedom Trail, the 1950s, devising a way to remember something that was happening in the 1760s and 70s. What's interesting about the fact of these 2 points is that they have a very complicated relationship. And so memory scholars are interested in understanding how one moment shapes the other and how that influence goes back and forth. I'll share one last project that's not about the Eastern Shore, because in many ways it relates to the Eastern Shore, a project that got at this issue of the 2 moments. I wrote a history some years ago about the Nantucket Whaling Museum on Nantucket Island. Fascinating story wherein, I don't know how much you all know about Nantucket, but Nantucket Island, we know it now as a wealthy place, often a tourist destination. The early 20th century was suffering an early kind of deindustrialization because the whaling industry had left, moved to the mainland, went to New Bedford. And the people who lived in Nantucket were faced with a problem. What are we going to do to survive? What will our economic engine be now? They noticed that there are some wealthy mainlanders exploring Nantucket, looking for investment opportunities, interested in tourism. So what the people in Nantucket did was created a museum where they could perform Nantucket's past for visitors as a way to entice private investment, to get people to come and stay. And the way they did this was fascinating. So if you see the fellow in the boat with the harpoon at the left of the screen, his name was George Grant, a Nantucketer. His father was a whaling captain. Grant knew, though, that he couldn't follow in that tradition by the 1920s when this is taken because that industry had gone. How was he going to survive? He made money for himself and survived by literally making himself into a museum exhibit, by performing whaling within an exhibit space, literally commodifying in some ways his body, right? He becomes a living part of this museum. And it worked. This campaign to entice tourists to come to Nantucket worked. And this story, as we will see, is relevant in many ways to the story of public memory on the Eastern Shore. So 3 questions that interest me and that run throughout my work. And I want to explain to you how I've been using these questions to understand public memory on the Eastern Shore. But first, I should tell you why I decided to come to the Eastern Shore to ask these questions. And so that itself has to do with a memory project, a rather personal memory project. So this all began around 2020. We were just talking about this, where my family and I were, like many of you, probably trying to find creative ways to deal with the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, and we wanted to be outside. And like many folks in this region, we ended up doing it by buying a boat and coming to the Chesapeake and doing some sailing. And the reason we did that is because I had personal memories of learning to sail on the Chesapeake, and that's the young me down there that's popped up on your screen. And I wanted to share that experience with my daughter and with my wife, and so we bought a boat, and we headed down the bay, and we ended up keeping the boat in the beautiful town of Rock Hall, Maryland, which is almost due east of us and a tiny bit south if you cross the bay. You can see it on the map here. And we had a wonderful time, in part because we enjoyed sailing, but also because we got to know a new place. Rock Hall became a sort of part of our life. And as we explored it, I became fascinated by the ways that I saw people who lived in Rock Hall had been communicating their sense of public memory. Very clearly, maritime labor, the kind of work that gets done on the water that I mentioned a few moments ago, is remembered in very specific and poignant ways in this community. I'm showing you just 3 instances. There are murals and other sorts of installations around town, but 3 instances where we see watermen being commemorated. One in front of a local museum. The guy in the middle is known locally as the Old Salt, although he is an actual person who's represented in this monument. And then the third image is of the old oyster tonging monument down in Rock Hall Harbor. Very clearly, maritime labor figures powerfully in the way that this community remembers publicly. But it also contrasts with what I know about the history of maritime labor in the Chesapeake Bay, which I know from being a historian, but also just spending time in museums and walking around in Annapolis and seeing that wonderful black boatman monument and looking at images. The image on the left is from the Library of Congress. I know that the history of labor on the Chesapeake is incredibly diverse, right? Diverse across categories of race, diverse across categories of gender, certainly diverse across all categories of identity. Maritime labor is always diverse because the water goes everywhere. It touches everyone. So I was very interested in the ways that Rock Hall was remembering maritime labor, but I was struck by how limited its view of that history was, because all of its monuments were commemorating white men in a very particular way. Stoic individuals standing alone, often with their tools in hand. It's a kind of grammar of memory that's very obvious here. And I've learned that this is not unique to Rock Hall, that communities all up and down the Eastern Shore have similar approaches to public memory, with some important exceptions. So why make these choices? Why these guys? Why remember in this way? This is a perfect project for somebody who's interested in the history of memory, right? This ties right back into our questions. I'm not going to go there quite yet. And so it was with that question about public memory in Rock Hall that I came to the project of writing an application for a fellowship to come study at the center. It seemed like a perfect opportunity, in part because I knew that the center and the Baldwin Library held the records of the Women's Eastern Shore Society of Maryland, which is a fascinating organization. Let me tell you a little bit about them, and then I'll play out the story a bit. So the Women's Eastern Shore Society organized in the early 1920s. They were a collective of women who lived in Baltimore, but either grew up in or had family connections to the Eastern Shore. So they possessed deep memories of lives lived on the Eastern Shore, though they, as adults, lived in Baltimore. And they organized the society as a way to enjoy fellowship, to socialize. And in their bylaws, they're very specific about what they wanted to achieve, which is they wanted to celebrate the history and culture of the Eastern Shore and literally perform a memory project. And I'm showing you a picture here from one of their annual meetings in Baltimore in 1923 and this is at the annual banquet that came after the meeting. So what an opportunity. Here's an organization that its purpose is to create public memory, right? And to do it on and in conversation with the Eastern Shore. And so I wrote my application. I was so delighted to be accepted. And I came down eagerly to look at the papers of this association, and Micah was kind enough to drag out these hulking big scrapbooks, leather-bound scrapbooks that contained all kinds of amazing clippings that the women assembled over years. They were consummate scrapbookers, and the scrapbooks document in really interesting ways how they were thinking about their work, how they were thinking about history, how they were thinking about memory over time. And they're fascinating. And I was going through these, and I was finding not at all what I was hoping for. I was hoping, as you know, I'm coming here to look for information about maritime labor. The Women's Eastern Shore Society was not interested in labor of any sort. Up until a certain point, I'll discuss that in a second, there is almost no reference to work done by anybody in their memory craft. There's very little attention to race in any way. Really, what the members of the society were interested in were ancient, distant, romantic pasts. A lot of Arthurian legend, a lot of stories of medieval knights. This was not uncommon at this moment in American history. Romanticism was quite common, but they were very committed to these old stories of distant memories of chivalric heroes protecting the honor of people in lands where there were threats. That's a theme that runs through all of their work, and they celebrated this by organizing fetes and parties and school contests, writing contests, and it's really interesting to read about, but it had nothing to do with my project. It wasn't what I wanted until 1952. You can imagine me paging through these scrapbooks, not seeing anything, and then kind of like a lightning bolt in the middle of the 1952 pages of entry in the scrapbook, I get this. Several newspaper clippings that show laboring people, maritime laboring people, right? Completely out of the context that the women of the Eastern Shore Society had been interested in. And it struck me, and this even turns out the article that's titled "The Bay's Rockfish Capital," that's about Rock Hall. So it even came full circle to the place I was working in. And it, like I said, it was like a lightning bolt. And I asked myself, why? Why suddenly in 1952 are they changing the ways they think about memory? Why are they remembering differently in this moment? What does it mean? And those three questions started popping up in my head. How do we connect 1952 to the times they're remembering? But then, before I even kind of did the preliminary analysis that I usually would do, it occurred to me that these guys looked really familiar. Maybe they look familiar to some of you too. They're not the same people that we see commemorated in Rock Hall, but can you see the stylistic similarities in the photographs and in the monuments? Very particular way of remembering maritime labor, stoic white men on their own, sometimes with their tools, represented in a very dramatic and stark way. There's some kind of through line here from 1952 to 2025. Going back to our three questions, thinking about the ways that we choose to remember, the ways we try to convince others to remember the way that we do, and the relationship between the two moments, there's very clearly a memory project unfolding right in front of me. And so what I have been doing ever since then is trying to go back and understand how public memory on the Eastern Shore functioned prior to 1952. So I could understand that when this change happened, I could understand what was actually changing. Now, I haven't told you what happened in 1952. I'm going to keep that till the very end so I can maintain a little bit of suspense. But what I do want to do is share with you some preliminary findings, really some kind of hunches about what's happening to Eastern Shore memory during this early period. Right? How is it evolving the way it is? And why does it change suddenly in 1952? So finding one. Finding is that sounds very formal. This is more of an impression. I'm getting the sense as I do this work that there is something quite special, different about the way that public memory evolves on the Eastern Shore compared to many other places in the United States. Some ways it's similar, in some ways it's different, but definitely unique. And immediately the first observation that strikes me in looking at these sources and thinking through them is how powerfully the legacy of plantation slavery cast a shadow over public memory making on the Eastern Shore during these years. And I want to talk about a couple ways in which that works, and we can see it in these early expressions of public memory. Some are I don't know, surprising, but seem trivial at first, but are remarkable in hindsight when you step back and look at the record set. I mentioned that the women of the Eastern Shore Society were very interested in medieval pasts, a lot of knights, a lot of chivalry, a lot of Arthurian legend. They even choose Lord Baltimore and his knightly attire on a mounted steed as the symbol of their organization. And it's fascinating because within the culture of early 20th century public memory, this idea of the mounted knight is a very common, very frequent bit of the iconography of white supremacy. Figures all throughout structural racism in the culture of the South in this moment, which is itself a legacy of plantation slavery, because Arthurian legend and knights were always part of the historical sensibilities of slaveholders, because those stories became very easy justifications, ways to rationalize the kind of structural social hierarchies that one needed to sustain the American slave system. You see that iconography at play throughout Eastern Shore memory in many powerful ways. I showed you the Eastern Shore Society's emblem. There's this other great photograph that I found or that's one of the archivists shared with me in the collections in the Baldwin Library that was taken at Tolchester Beach, which was a resort just a few miles north of Rock Hall on the bay, operated roughly from 1880 into the 1950s, maybe even to the 60s. Some of you may know better than I do. And Tolchester was a place where folks from Baltimore could take a ferry over and spend a day recreating and enjoying the rural atmosphere. And there's an equestrian ring there where they put on Roman chariot races. I assume they're races or maybe even fanciful fights like what you would see at a Renaissance fair today. But that kind of equestrian cosplay was part of that sort of residual lost cause ideology. The iconography of it was part of that. And it had been recently repopularized in the United States by D.W. Griffin's famous film, Birth of a Nation, which appeared in 1915. So in some ways, you can see the memory work of the society just swimming in this air of ideas that are very much shaped by legacies of slavery. And so it's a complicated and difficult thread to unwind, but I'm attending to it in various ways, in part by thinking about how the legacy of enslavement, in this case, creates a vein of public memory that seeks to forget, to choose to forget emancipation. And this is one project I see unfolding in the strain of public memory that the society is engaged in. I'll give you an example of this, purposeful forgetting of emancipation. There's a great cache of records here at the center that include the school papers of Elizabeth Lloyd. So Lloyd is a descendant of the Lloyd family. You may know Colonel Lloyd, who presides over Y Plantation, which is the plantation that Frederick Douglass famously describes in the first pages of his autobiography. Douglass was enslaved, not by Lloyd, by one of Lloyd's employees, but on that plantation. Elizabeth Lloyd is a descendant of that Colonel Lloyd, and during the early decades of the 20th century, the first decade, she lives between Baltimore and the plantation, goes back and forth. And we have her school papers. So she's about 10 years old at this point. And I'm guessing she has a private tutor, but we don't, he's a harsh grader. I know that. I don't know anything else about this person. But we have papers that she wrote for him, or most likely her, that respond to prompts. Many of the prompts are write a history, and she writes Arthurian legend, a lot of Bible stories too. But the one that I wanted to share with you was the paper that Elizabeth Lloyd writes when about 10 years old about Christmas at the Y Plantation. And I'll just read this to you quickly. At 12, we went out to the library, and soon the colored children on the place all assembled there to see the Christmas tree. We gave them the candy, cakes, and nuts that we had tied up in paper napkins for them, and after they had murmured their thanks, we went into lunch. Then what a glorious afternoon we spent opening our presents. This is remarkable because what Lloyd is describing is a centuries-old plantation tradition, right, that we are seeing living intact in 1910, 1911, thereabouts. And so when I say that there's a strain of memory that seeks to forget emancipation, this is what I'm talking about, right? An attempt to remember, to write about the present in a way that simply ignores the inconvenient fact for these folks of universal enfranchisement. A third way in which I see the legacy of plantation slavery figuring in the story of public memory on the Eastern Shore, and this is I think, fairly unique. It's something that I've been thinking a lot about lately, is the way that, how to put this, public memory as it's connected with landscapes of enslavement on the Eastern Shore tends to remain very private as public memory. So you may know that by the 1920s, 1930s, it has become popular in Maryland and Virginia, surrounding states, to make public landscapes of enslavement. Think about Mount Vernon, George Washington's Mount Vernon. Think about Monticello. Think about all the many house museums that become publicly open during that period. And often what happens there is the descendants of those families will put the home into some kind of trust, make it public through a partnership with a nonprofit organization, and in so doing, do a public good. That doesn't happen on the Eastern Shore. At least I'm not seeing evidence of it. So we can go back to Y House, for instance. Y House remains in private ownership till this day. And I know the owners have been very good about opening it up for use by scholars and historians. But we don't see that expansion of a public historical infrastructure on the Eastern Shore during this time period as we do in other parts of the United States. So there is this legacy. I think it has a lot to do with the complicated economics of family inheritance after the war, lack of diverse opportunities to grow wealth for these folks, some other factors. But there is a legacy from slavery that makes it so that the places where it occurred remain very private. Okay? And that's going to have significance for us in a few moments, so keep that in mind. So finding one, the long and dark shadow of plantation slavery on public memory. Now, there are other strains of public memory on the Eastern Shore that I see coming into conversation with what is communicated in the Eastern Shore Society's work. And it took me a while to understand this too. This is a fun challenge of working in an archive. So another wonderful document here in the center, Center's collections, is this history of the Eastern Shore written by James Donnell Tilghman. And what was complicated about this was that it was a history very, very unlike the history that the women of the Eastern Shore Society were interested in telling, in so much as Tilghman's history, which he wrote about 1936, 37, I'm not exactly sure. But his history puts labor and race right up front. He's interested in bringing these stories to our ways of remembering the Eastern Shore. The trick was, though, I couldn't figure out why he was writing this or for whom, because the object didn't have context with it. And so I did a little sleuthing, and I ended up finding his writing published, exactly this document, edited but then published later on in an important book for our story. And that book is this, A Maryland Guide to the Old Line State, which appears in 1940. And this is something you can find often in used bookstores. Maybe some of you have a copy of this laying around. It was produced widely because it was the WPA's official state guide to Maryland. For those of you who don't know, WPA, Works Progress Administration, labor relief program sponsored by Franklin Delano Roosevelt during the New Deal. It sponsored other programs, including the Federal Writers Project that put out-of-work writers and artists, gave them a job. So Tilghman was contracted by the WPA through the Federal Writers Project to write a chapter for the Maryland State Guidebook, which was designed by the WPA to be essentially a tourist guide, right? A way for people to come visit Maryland. One of these was made for every state. They're really fun documents. The idea was people would buy them, come visit Maryland, drive around. At the same time, the WPA was also sponsoring a historic road marker project, and so those two things speak to each other in interesting ways. But consider this. Look at the cover of this book. Maritime labor, right there on the cover, right? Which contrasts in very clear ways with Lord Baltimore as a knight on horseback. Two ways of remembering Eastern Shore memory. In contrast, competing against one another in the same moment, different ways. It makes sense that Tilghman's essay, sponsored by the WPA, would be interested in labor and race because these are issues that Roosevelt's administration wants to explore, right? And so we have that interesting conversation. And it also makes us, or gives us reason to think about ways in which race and labor are being experienced elsewhere on the Eastern Shore in that moment. And thanks to some folks I'll mention in just a second, we can remember this particular moment. So despite the attempt by that first strain of public memory to forget emancipation, we nonetheless see black people on the Eastern Shore fighting insistently to make sure they're not forgotten. And we see this coming through in the labor movement. During 1931 and then 1938, two incredible strikes by women working in Crisfield, Maryland's crab picking plants, primarily African-American women in these spaces, who decide to insist upon a living wage. with the assistance from some labor organizers, and wage successful strikes and win their wage increase during the 30s, but not without incredible resistance. And here I'm going to newspapers for my documentation, but these women were pushed back by white supremacists at every turn. Policemen turning their cheek, ignoring violence, cars were burned, gangs would roam the streets trying to intimidate them, but they persisted. And we see in the 1930s what I believe is another kind of public memory movement. In my read of this, we can see Black labor activism as a public memory campaign to resist forgetting emancipation, to make sure that the accomplishments and gains and humanity of Black people in the Eastern Shore is being remembered. So I see these folks pushing back too against the kind of public memory that the Women's Eastern Shore Society embraces. And I mentioned we wouldn't even know about this were it not for the ancestors. And in some cases, I think maybe at least one or two women who were involved in those strikes, who gathered together just a few years ago to insist that the state remember what happened. And 2 years ago, maybe 2024, early 2025, a monument was erected to remember the crab pickers strike in Crisfield. So this is a remarkable accomplishment of public memory, but it took a very long time, right? Which is important to keep in mind. So I see, what do we have? I'm counting my fingers. 3 different strains of public memory competing on the Eastern Shore in the 1930s. We have the first kind typified by the Women's Eastern Shore Society, racially exclusive, focused on a distant past. We've got the WPA that is interested in thinking about labor and race, but also hanging that story on tourism and economic development, right? Trying to get people to the Eastern Shore and spend their dollars, help folks out during the Depression. And then we have a third strain, sort of squarely lodged within the Black community, right? That is expressing itself through labor activism. I'm going to skip this slide. And just to make clear that I perceive these forces coming into conflict in the 30s as a historian, but just to make clear that it seems like these folks also sense the conflict, I'll take you back to the Women's Society of the Eastern Shore for a moment and show you how we can see an expression of this concern about racial anxiety, at least, in their own papers. So if you look through the bylaws of the organization, it's really quite striking. They reprinted bylaws in their constitution every time a change was made, which happened every few years. And if you read them carefully, they all look exactly the same, but if you read carefully, you find interesting changes. For instance, in 1936, the Women's Eastern Shore Society would admit any woman is highlighted here, 18 years of age, so on and so on, with a connection to the Eastern Shore. Go forward a few years, 1943, any white woman. Something has cracked, right? Something has changed there. I don't know what it is, and as a historian, we need to be very careful about speculation, but it's clear that between 1936 and 1943, the Women's Eastern Shore Society has become very nervous about matters of race. I can't imagine that this organization was ever integrated to begin with, but for some reason they decided to formalize themselves as a segregated organization. It's interesting, too, this occurs in the wake of World War II, or in the midst of World War II. That certainly could have some impact here as well. But for a group that is very reticent about why they do what they do, we can look to other documents to get a sense of what they're thinking about and what they're worried about. So we have these forms of memory coming into collision. Where I am in this research project now is trying to understand what happens to them between that point and the 1950s. And what I think happens, let me just give you kind of a map of this and then I'll explain it. I think the Women's Eastern Shore Society version of public memory and the WPA's version of public memory find a way to work together and to create a new strain that ultimately excludes that other strain we talked about, the public memory of working black people on the Eastern Shore. I think that's what happens. Let me show you why I think that. And this is my third finding. At the same time, we see all of this memory work, including the memory of laboring people, the watermen that I mentioned earlier, getting very closely bound up with auto tourism and economic development on the Eastern Shore. How does it work? How do we know this is happening? One way we know it's happening is that the Women's Society become more eagerly interested as the 1930s unfold in newspaper articles that document efforts to bring tourists to the Eastern Shore. And so you can see in their clippings articles like this, The Show Through a Windshield, which is really a guide inviting people to come from Baltimore and elsewhere and providing instructions where you can drive and how you can see this beautiful historic place from your own car. And often these travel guides include pictures of boats, not quite yet laboring people on the waterfront, but nonetheless they appeal to a sense of historical imagery tied to the water, okay, enticing visitors to the Eastern Shore. We can see this expressed in this really fun commemorative stamp campaign that's sponsored by the state of Maryland. The women of the society put all of these stamps into their scrapbooks and they arranged them in a really interesting way. This is in 1939. These stamps were issued again as a way to generate interest in visiting the Eastern Shore. The Women's Eastern Shore Society loves this idea. This is all about encouraging tourism and travel, but also interesting for us because we can see the beginning of the maturation of a particular kind of iconic representation of the Eastern Shore that stresses maritime themes. There's the crab, there are the oyster boats, there's the charter boat fishing. No people in these images, which is interesting, right? We don't see the labor yet, but we see indices of the labor. So ways of thinking publicly about what the Eastern Shore is are changing during this period. And then we see the Women's Eastern Shore Society become increasingly interested in ferries and bridge building. In fact, they begin hosting events that have to do with celebrating the opening of new ferry lines from Baltimore to Kent Island, for instance. They get involved in the policy discussion that's working toward trying to advocate for the construction of a bay bridge. More on that in a second. Why are they involved in this? This is a fun little bit from this program that celebrated the opening of a ferry line. We of the Eastern Shore welcome our fellow Marylanders to our section of the state and hope you will visit us often and that many of you will make your permanent abode with us. They want people to visit the Eastern Shore and stay, meaning they want them to buy real estate. And the campaign to attract that kind of investment begins to work by the 1930s. So here, from their scrapbook is a newspaper article talking about the purchase of Blakeford, which is a colonial mansion in Queenstown. I don't know if you know where this is located, right on the mouth of the Chester River, south of Rock Hall. Old historical property. It seems like the campaign to attract outside investment works because the purchaser of this is a wealthy New York industrialist, a fellow named George Moffett, who is quite interesting. He's the president of the Corn Products Refining Company. These are the people that invented margarine some decades before, about a decade before, that become very involved in industrial corn production, helping the war effort and building up post-war industry. And this guy hates Roosevelt. So if you dig into his politics, he's an anti-FDR, big money industrialist, and he's exactly the kind of people that this tourism campaign is intended to attract. Folks that want to come, put their money into the Eastern Shore, be fairly quiet about it, and maybe buy up one of those old plantation homes, right, that aren't being offered publicly, but perhaps privately. This goes on for decades, and in fact, as I followed this thread. I learned later on that in the Baltimore Sun, there's some investigative reporting decades later. Where have all these very, very wealthy outside investors come from who own homes on the Eastern Shore? And in 1998, this was going on, a more recent one asked about Russian investment on the Eastern Shore. We can tie this back to this moment in the 1930s. Economic development, running tight on time, so I'll skip a slide or two. All organized around this project of marketing the Eastern Shore to tourists as a place where, yes, you can buy a piece of the colonial past, the plantation past, if you're a private investor, and while you're there, you can enjoy the historical experience of seeing people working on the waterfront. This is a successful marketing message. It worked on Nantucket. Remember I told you about the Nantucket story? It works on the Eastern Shore. But I want to point out that in marketing the Eastern Shore to wealthy investors, we lose that third strain of memory, because capital likes to invest in stories that explains the success of capital. And that does not include the story of working black people on the Eastern Shore. And so we see that strain of public memory very clearly excised from this work. Okay, why 1952? We're near the end, so let me make my big unveil. The Women's Eastern Shore Society, in their involvement in these efforts to bolster tourism, to create a form of public memory that attracts investment from outside, becomes very political. They become friends with Senator George Radcliffe, for instance. He becomes a sponsor of many of their projects. They write a song about him. They become very involved in supporting the work of conservation clubs on the Eastern Shore. Conservation clubs, interesting kind of organization, almost like an informal labor union that represent the interests of white boatmen who are concerned about sustaining harvests. In some ways, these men are kind of like the new knights of the Women's Society's work. They're all brought together, Radcliffe, the ladies, the conservation societies, in 1952, around this project of celebrating the opening of the bridge, of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge. That's the moment. It's the big moment for them, because with the opening of that bridge, the floodgates have opened for investment on the Eastern Shore. The Women's Society wants to be there for it. Radcliffe has in part been the architect of this vision. I can talk more about that in the Q&A if you like. And what has happened is that these public memory projects have effectively created this campaign of selling not just the colonial plantation past, not just crabs and oyster boats, not just recreational fishing, but also the presence of laboring people who have been here for generations, just like George Grant and that boat in Nantucket. They've become part of the exhibits. And so my thinking right now is that the persistence of this commemorative treatment of white, stoic watermen is because folks on the Eastern Shore know the fisheries are an uneven enterprise. It's a boom and bust economy. But we can still monetize that economy toward bolstering the tourism trade. And these men, in some ways, become part of the exhibit that's being sold to tourists, part of the charm of the waterfront. And we can skip through this. And this has remained remarkably persistent to this day. That's why those monuments still clamor for our attention on the Eastern Shore. It's changed a little bit. The actual men have been replaced by the monuments. Added into the story of laboring white watermen along the Eastern Shore are, for instance, these annual workboat gatherings. The Chesapeake Cowboys, I believe, one of these groups is called Demonstrating Mastery and Skill of Traditional Watercraft. That's part of the story too, all blended into how we remember the Eastern Shore. but still very much excluding that other vein of memory, right? That we talked about with regard to the diversity of laboring water people, that hopefully my work can help shine a light on. All right, I've held you long enough. Thank you very much for listening.
Yeah, great project, by the way, really interesting. I have a question, I think, about more methodological or theoretical aspect. Mm-hmm. You're talking about which facts are remembered. We could even talk about how those facts are interpreted. But what happens if people don't agree on what the facts are? You know, you're talking about when things are being remembered. I'm talking about the current moment when there's a lot of government power, in fact, being deployed to determine what the truth is, right? So how would that change your project? I mean, I have an example I could talk to you about that just happened a couple days ago, but yeah.
There's a lot of job security for people who study memory and debates about memory, right? Because of the reasons you're asking. Because we end up often getting at loggerheads about questions about the truth. Well, which version is right? And which one do we go for? Who do we remember, who do we not? So, I mean, my basic line on this question is that if we stop talking about the disagreement, that's when we have the problem. So policies that aim at prohibiting or stopping discourse about competing memory claims are problematic policies. Democracy only works when we have open discourse. So my memory work is about encouraging opening discourse. So I can't, that's what I do. So I would never want to stop a person from offering a contrary way of remembering unless their intent in doing that was to harm somebody or somehow attack.
Well, I'm talking about harm, actually, you know.
It's harmful. I mean, people have died over memory contests, right? So the solution, I don't offer a solution. I offer my ability to create a space to talk about it. Okay. But clearly political activism is one important way that we need to address that problem.
Okay.
Thank you for the question.
Thank you. I agree very much with your findings. I'm from the Eastern Shore of Maryland, Caroline County.
Thank you.
And my family has been raised in Caroline, Dorchester, and Talbot counties. So my family's been there forever.
Yeah.
In fact, we own a town there. And we have a conservation group that's interested in my community. So when you talked about that third finding, it really disturbed me. Mm-hmm. So could you tell me some of the motivations behind some of these conservationists?
So, when I was talking about the Conservation Association?
Yes.
Yeah, so I think, different moment in time, mm-hmm. right? So in the 1950s at least, I go back to my microphone, sorry. Mm-hmm. So there's been some good scholarship done on how conservation societies in the 1950s work in Virginia. I can point you to an article about this if we talk later on. And the historians who did that work found out that this particular kind of conservation organizations primarily organized around assisting white watermen in advocating for particular policies that protected harvests that helped them economically. Mm-hmm. So that's probably good for everybody in the community, but what these scholars pointed out is those men then leveraged their participation in the conservation societies to keep black watermen from getting captain's licenses, for instance, right? That kind of sort of casual segregation persisted through the conservation societies. But that's in that moment in time. So that's me talking about that phenomenon. Obviously, there are many strains of conservation and different approaches to it now. So I don't want to speak beyond.
Yeah, I understand, but that triggers some things in me, just the thought of this. But as you're going through your findings, you know, growing up on the shore, going to the schools on the shore, and knowing the history that was presented to us, it was our African American communities that told us who we were. Mm-hmm. And no matter what the history was, we had those elders that spoke to us and imbued in us our identity. And the laboring type of thing where I grew up was on the water, not just that, not just a shop tank. It was also in the poultry factories. Also, as far as the vegetables and things of that sort, more so really with the vegetables that were grown in that particular region. But there's a brain drain where many of us have left. And now we're in communities where the older people have gone and the land stays still. But I'm trying to get my family to stay.
Yeah, that's interesting. You know, a lot of folks will make an argument about memory based on demographics. Well, there aren't so many people of this group or that group around anymore, so we need not include them in a memory discourse. But this isn't an issue of like, you know, to the most belongs the memory, right? Memory is the process of thinking about change over time. And so the issue is to keep track of everyone, even if their people have moved on to another place. So I'm glad you shared that observation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I came in a little behind you, but two things I wanted to ask you about. One was, how does museums and other places that exhibit the story decide which version of memory to display?
Right.
And the other question is, how does capital decide what to invest in if they're only investing in what's successful?
Yeah, well, you kind of answered your own question in a way, right?
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, well, I mean, they invest in what's successful. No, these are both great questions. So how do museums decide what to include, what not to include? And then the second part, you know, how does capital get focused? Well, so, you know, the first question is kind of structural and historical answers. So museums are curated. Curation is always a choice, so somebody's always choosing what to put in and what not to put in. The good news, I think, in terms of thinking about the course of public history over the last half century is that what people generally have chosen to include has become more inclusive and has been more subject to invited critique by community members and stakeholders and neighbors. And I think we're getting better history in museums all the time. However, museums have very complicated roles in their communities, right? You can do a critical exhibit on one day, but you can also serve capital in a somewhat non-critical way on another day, depending on how your programming works. So my sense in the story of museums is the struggle has been, if our mission is to do good, solid, critical, inclusive history, how do we match that against the interest of donors who aren't always interested in doing that kind of history? And this is, you know, fortunately, I love museums. Working in a museum would be difficult getting caught in this conundrum, right? Because museums are also under attack right now by radical defunding campaigns coming from all directions. So my thought on this is that if you live near a museum that you are concerned to impact, you should do your best to make your voice known in that space. And if your voice isn't heard in that space, then create spaces that can respond to the museum and maybe convince them to think otherwise. That's kind of general advice I give to people who are unsatisfied by neighborhood museums. But there's absolutely no question that deep currents of structural racism run through the ways that museums curate exhibits, have for generations, still do. Especially in the way that money works in those spaces. So I don't have answers for these questions, but we can bring that problem into the open and talk about it in productive ways, I think.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Bruggeman. It's been such a engaging conversation, and we're so grateful that you were able to share the fruits of some of your research here over the past year. The Ashby M. Larmore Fellowship is an annual offering, and we're excited to be sharing new research on the Eastern Shore with you next year as well.